Good evening. I'm Catherine Footer. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. I'm going to break a rule about introductions, and I'm going to talk about myself for a minute. I wrote this very nice introduction for Tony, and I made a very big mistake. I told him that I was going to do an introduction, and he wrote back and he said, I want it to be very, 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 I think there were 4 veries, short, and it can only be 10 words. So I was going to tell you about how he arrived in Kansas City in December in 2014 for 30 months, and about 3 weeks into his first stay as interim president, KCAI, that was one word, that we all wanted him to stay longer. So I was also going to say that he was born in Great Britain, but I think you're going to get that pretty quickly when he starts talking, and that he was educated at Goldsmiths in London, and he also has an MFA from Tulane, but I won't talk about that either. He is CBE, which I'm not going to waste 5 words to tell you that it's Commander of the British Empire. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the rest of my words. So let's see, vision, leader, passion, art historian, which I'm going to hyphenate, so that's 1 word. School of the Art Institute of Chicago twice. We'll just use it by its acronym, so that's SAIC, that's 1 word. And let's see, what else did I have? I had a curator, author, wife, Patty, Carol, we'll just call Patty being 1 word. And finally, and not least of all, friend.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here tonight, especially because in the middle of this presentation, we're going to have a little celebration of something that has just happened, which I think is just quite wonderful. But we're going to talk about this mysterious man, the man who disappeared, the ghost of Archibald Knox. And to do that, we're going to leave Kansas City and we're going to go to London, England. And through the magic of time travel, when we arrive in London, it's going to be the year 1895. When we arrive in London, we're going to get on a train. The train is called the Manx Man, and we're going to travel through the night. We're going to go up through Birmingham to the port city of Liverpool. We're then going to get on a boat. We're going to sail for 5 hours. We're going to arrive in the tiny Isle of Man, 22 miles by 18 miles. We're going to take a pony and trap, and we're going to end up at a little village called Sulby, just about as remote a place as you could possibly get, a long way from anything. And just imagine what that was like in 1895. And we've made this journey to meet this man, Archibald Knox, one of the most prolific and incredible designers of the late 19th century and 20th century, but a person who disappeared from the history books. And yet, when we think about the great designers of that same period, around the turn of the century, Frank Lloyd Wright, Charles Rennie, Mackintosh, Joseph Hoffmann in Vienna, he outstripped them all by the sheer volume and the quality of the work that he presented. So here he is, the design provider, as I call him. And the story tonight is actually about 2 men, because it's about him and about this extraordinary man, Sir Arthur Lazenby Liberty, the creator of Liberties of London, a giant of commerce in Britain at the turn of that century, captain of industry, an entrepreneur, immensely wealthy, very, very smart, very, very visionary, but also gregarious, a social man, the exact opposite of Archibald Knox, who was essentially a hermit. I met somebody who actually knew Knox during his life, and she said he was almost Cistercian in his silence. A very, very quiet, reserved, and very, very unusual man, living on the Isle of Man. Dramatic coastline, very exciting and wonderful space. These are the kinds of dramas that he would have seen as a child as Knox walked through the landscape and began to draw the things that he saw, including, as you might see in the foreground, seaweed, trees. He began to walk through this landscape and assembled books full of drawings that eventually became the source material that led to the work that he made, the key to the Celtic revival. What a wonderful landscape, and an old landscape. Just because I couldn't remember, I checked when the pyramids were built, 2500 BC. There's been human occupation on the Isle of Man for 6,500 years, when this island was connected by a land bridge to Scotland in the north, Wales to the east, and Ireland to the west. So a very, very old country, an amazing history. You may know the Isle of Man for different reasons. This little kitten is a Manx cat, and they're born with no tails. There are other things on the island that are a little strange too, and you don't want to meet these on a dark night. This is a Manx ram. And also, if you really want to put your life in peril, then you could enter and take your motorbike and go to the world's most dangerous, most lethal motorcycle race in the world, the Manx TT, the time trials. So Knox himself came from a family from Scotland. They had emigrated to the Isle of Man, and they were engineers. Not ordinary engineers, ship engineers. So as a young man, he was trained, along with his 5 brothers, to go down into the engine rooms of these boats that went around the islands and learn how to take those engines apart, to repair them. He was good with his hands. He looked hard at what he was working with. He had a talented family that helped him. So he was doing that during the days, and then at the weekends, whenever the opportunity came, he went out into this landscape, this ancient landscape that had had endless invasions, had become under the persuasion eventually of Christianity, a Christian island. But all over the island, there were these crosses, these markers, covered with what is called runic scribblings, the interlocking ways of the Celtic knot. And he would find these and draw them, and they're still out there in the landscape. If I was to show you an aerial photograph of the Isle of Man, you'd see about 1,000 of these dotting the landscape. The landscape was thickly sprinkled with these kinds of pieces. He begins to draw them, and he's doing frottage. He's rubbing the stones too. And he's extrapolating from them the designs and the ideas. So here's a typical Celtic runic cross, made about 800 AD on the Isle of Man. There are others that are even bigger, well over the height of 10 or 12 feet. And these were documented in books that he was reading. So you see that Celtic knotting. And you probably better know this from things like this, the Lindisfarne Gospel and the Irish Book of Kells. Very, very beautiful design works. They are both phytomorphic, isn't that a wonderful word? And zoomorphic. In other words, they derive from plant forms and they derive from zoological forms too. But this knotting, this form of Celtic intertwining called entrelac, is about the journey of human beings through life. The snakes are always seen to be eating their own tails. And they lock together in this sort of dance. And the idea here is that life is eternity, and it's constantly regenerating itself. That's part of the Celtic spirit. So Knox was drawing this, and in fact, he went on a sort of weekend trip across to Dublin. And he saw the Book of Kells. He saw the real Celtic world being revealed. He collected books himself, including this famous book, The Runic and Monumental Remains on the Isle of Man, by Cummings. So he was looking at this very hard. Notice particularly the decoration up the sides of the page and the decoration at the very top, because they appear in a kind of Celtic copying that Knox does in his work a little bit later. The island had a very checkered history and seemed to be very nice people, except for this lot, who used to come and visit on a fairly regular basis, and you definitely do not want to meet the Vikings. Because this lot were only interested in one thing, plunder. So here they are, happily hacking the priests to death, while the monastery burns in the distance, but notice the crosses. Now, these Celtic crosses are not only Christian crosses, they're Viking crosses too. So you have this mixture of people. And look what he's holding. Not the axe. He's stealing, as you can see in his hand there, he's stealing a chalice that has come from the church that they're busily burning. This kind of chalice. This is an extraordinary object. It was made around 900 AD. It's called the Ardagh chalice because it was found in Ardagh Island in 1868. It was squashed flat, completely flat. And the thought is that it had probably been squashed flat in order to be able to store it and hide it from the Vikings. Well, when this object was discovered and over a long period of time restored, it was part of a beginning to re-understand the Celtic past, which was almost certainly, in the Celtic revival, literary. The Abbey Theatre in Dublin presenting plays in Erse, the original language of Ireland. So when people saw that, they became very excited about this ancient past. And then at Tara in Ireland, they found this. This absolutely fabulous brooch made in gold, about 700 AD, and found in Ireland in 1850. So slowly, these discoveries begin to inform people who become excited about this kind of past, and they're looking at these amazing deluxe gospel books, the Book of Kells here, for example, from 800 AD. Looking at that knotting, the way things are put together, the overlapping, that constant idea of a thread or a chain that joins together. And Owen Jones had published this book called The Grammar of Ornament in 1856, which illustrated Celtic design, some of which had come from those Celtic crosses and some of them from the Book of Kells, and was presenting this on a much bigger stage in a publication in Britain. And if you look at all of that whiplash curve and all of those spaghetti forms that you see in that, it's no surprise that this was being looked at by people like Aubrey Beardsley. There's a direct connection between Art Nouveau, especially continental Art Nouveau, and the Celtic world. And the real Celts, of course, are up there in Scotland too. So here you have Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, the wife of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, producing these works. These are gesso panels. These works, again, which look at that idea of the figure growing into this kind of material that has come from the natural world. And her sister, Frances MacDonald McNair. Look at the frame that goes around this picture in particular, and look at these extraordinary knottings that you see in the corners that look like spider's web. They come, facsimile, from St. Patrick's Bell, made in Ireland in 1100. So if you look at that knotting here, it's copied. So people were going back and looking at this material and seeing it as an inspiration. It was nostalgic, it was romantic, it was completely daft, and it started to appear in things like this. And this began to have a real impact. This painting went all through Europe on tour. Druids, if there were ever any druids bringing in the mistletoe by two artists, Hornell and Henry, painted in Scotland. So you see these druids, these Celtic druids. Notice the one on the right-hand side is carrying a torque, which is a sort of a medal form, like a bracelet you would put around your neck. And they exhibited this, and it was heavily Celtic. Heavily Celtic, not just because of the painting. This is it with the frame. The frame is absolutely extraordinary. It's a real piece of Celtic design coming from those crosses and then integrating that painting together. And you see where the priest is holding the torque on the bottom right-hand side, that's repeated at the top of the frame. So this Celtic world really began to come to life, and there has to be something that drove it all, and this is it. It's a book, The Celtic Twilight, written by W.B. Yeats. This is a portrait on the left-hand side of him at his most consumptive. Depictions of the druids, heroes, fairies, and deep melancholy. That was the driving force and the sense, the umbrella under which all of this Celtic revival suddenly begins to appear. And so Knox is fully aware of all of this, but he's also aware of what's happening in contemporary art. because he had a mentor, friend, and later employer, this dashing chap, Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott, an English arts and crafts architect who was working on the Isle of Man and who had lots of magazines like The Studio. So Knox, while he was working with Bailey Scott, knew exactly what was going on in contemporary Vienna, in contemporary London, in Paris. He was completely au fait with what was going on in contemporary expression, while at the same time looking back at the ancient world he was in. And Mackay Bailey Scott was a terrific architect. This is one of his houses. So we were looking at this idea of the arts and crafts movement being alive and well. Not only was he building these things, but he was part of a movement that disseminated materials, and they were always in full color lithographs. So even if you never went to a Bailey Scott house, you knew what he was looking at, the integration of all of the elements into the design, what the Germans would call Gesamtkunstwerk, joining everything together so that you have an architectural exterior, an interior which contains all of the detailing from the wallpaper to the woodwork to the curtains, the furniture, all of this joined together. And from that, whether you were living on the Isle of Man or you were living in Scotland or Wales or anywhere, you got a sense of what this idea was, that you had this integrated form of the arts and crafts movement. And when you actually saw it real, and here it is, you see how those drawings are really so accurate. You got a sense of this is your lifestyle. This is the ideal. This is what you want to do. And you could do everything. So Bailey Scott was not only designing architecture, everything that we see here had come from his hand. And that idea of a totality of vision crosses to Archibald Knox. Knox sees the kind of work that Bailey Scott is doing, including this incredible object. This is the Manx Man piano, meaning the piano from the Isle of Man, designed by Bailey Scott in 1896. And this is exactly the time when Archibald Knox was working with him. So Knox was in a world that had all of this. What a shambles. The Egyptian revival, the Romanesque revival, the Lombardic, I have no idea what this means, or Renaissance revival, then classic versus Gothic, medievalism, Rome, all of this stuff was going on all at the same time. There was one person who was particularly interested in every one of these movements because he monetized them all. And that was this extraordinary man, Sir Arthur Lazenby Liberty, and his amazing wife, who was a brilliant photographer. They traveled to Japan and she produced incredible photographs of Japan. I'm not sure that he himself actually could draw, but he prided himself on having a direct connection with the artistic vision. And he had already built an extraordinary empire. Liberties of London actually began as East India House. And here it is on Regent Street in 1895. You can see Liberty's name appears at the bottom in the left, but the original name, East India. And what he was doing was building a bazaar. He said that his shop was an emporium and a bazaar and a crossroads of influences and nationalities, styles that were brought from many, many miles away. This is how we see Liberties today, with its extraordinary arts and crafts interior. This is the central emporium. If you're ever in London, you should go. And what he was selling was this. He advertised his emporium as being the place where you would be able to find the best examples from India, from Persia, from Japan, from China, and you would be able to be part of that aesthetic movement, finding the most beautiful objects. So here we have two figures. I didn't know the Japanese devils only have 3 toes, very sharp, but they're making objects that would then be displayed, and particularly fabrics. So here we have Liberty and Company. Write for the illustrated catalog and you'd be able to find all these things. Absolutely wonderful Japanese things. Well, Japanism, the Japanese revival, had taken over Europe. People were absolutely besotted by anything to do with Europe. And it came actually not just from the artwork that was being imported, but from one simple event, the Mikado. When the Mikado appeared first at the Dolly Carts Opera Company at Sadler's, this was something that changed everything. the opera became repeated over and over, the longest running performances in the world, and everybody was looking at the fans, was looking at the landscape, Japanese gardens, bonsai, etc. And the idea for all of this had actually come from Liberty's, because Liberty's had an exhibition of Japanese wares. So you could go and see tea being made, and you could have Japanese rice and all the rest of the kind of thing. And that was taking place inside the store. So guess who went along, saw this, and took some photographs? Well, three little maids from school, are we? This is actually Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan. Took this photograph of these two wee girls pouring tea, and that is the basis of the Mikado. And when that happened, the monetization of the Japanese spirit was something that Liberty saw immediately, that he could make into something that would be desirable and exciting and different, all the things that people wanted. And so Liberty's become art fabrics, beautiful and allegedly inexpensive. And this is the kind of promotional material that they were putting out. So this is Koko and the Japanese figures coming from the Mikado. So he starts selling things like this. These are cloisons, Japanese cloisons, and people want these because this is part of the aestheticization. Remember, you're trying to live your life in this particular style, so you have to have this. So if you have an aesthetic household, you need to have this. And here is the aesthetic bridegroom with his intense wife. And he is saying to her, while they're looking at this Japanese pot, "It is quite consummate, is it not?" And the intense bride replies saying, "It is indeed. Oh, Algernon, let us try to live up to it." Well, Liberty looked at all of this and thought, how are we going to turn this into something that we can put in people's houses? Can you possibly imagine Hokusai's woodblock print, The Great Wave, turning into a bowl in which to put bonbons? Well, if you're smart enough, you can do that. So this is the kind of thing that Liberty was now making. Not only the original objects being imported, but objects that were based on the objects that were being imported. And what he was bringing in were things like this. Wonderful set of teaspoons from Japan, made in silver. And you can see there's a little pagoda over on the right-hand side, little sailing boat. All of these things coming from original Japanese ideas. And this absolutely extraordinary. This is a set of fish servers in the shape of fish. So you can see on this side, there's a skate, and then there's the other side of the skate. And then this fork is actually like seaweed, or like a sea serpent here. They were quite extraordinary things. He was producing very, very beautiful things, because the objects he was choosing from Japan are things that he'd seen himself. When he and his wife went to Japan, they were choosing the very best pieces. So you could look at something like this, see the Japanese technology. How did they make this? And this became important to the silversmiths working in Birmingham and London. Vases that had a kabuki mask on the side. And this Japanese thing was everywhere. This is Mrs. Monet, who, by the way, did not have red hair. Monet made her wear a wig because it fitted into the picture better. But this was everywhere, and this was the way people were wanting to live their life, was to be surrounded by these Japanistic objects. At the same time, he was producing arts and crafts fabric, and he was personally involved with this. So he was commissioning artists and designers to create original fabrics based often on geometric or floral designs, as we see here. And he actually specified these himself. So here is Sir Arthur Liberty with John Llewellyn on the right-hand side, who was his buyer. And here they are examining new fabric. And it went everywhere because they were developing full-color catalogs. So if you were in the north of Scotland or the west of Ireland, you could write away and you'd get a catalog for these dreamy dresses made of incredible materials. And of course, your children had to be subdued and dressed in this way too, because that was part of the whole lifestyle. And if you didn't like things like Kate Greenaway well, then there was always the opportunity of doing something that was more Arabian. This is how he used to dress the shop girls. They were required to wear Japanese kimono and Indian and Arabian clothes like this, so that you could go into and look at the type of Arab smoking room furnished by Messrs. Liberty, and they would ship this to you in pieces. So it's an early form of IKEA. You would buy what you like, and they would ship it to you. So you wanted something like an Arab smoking room, or did you want something that had come from the fire? Would you want these chairs? All of these photographs and these drawings showed you how you could set up your life. And if you didn't want something quite as exotic as that, you could go back to the arts and crafts movement. Every detail here shown, and every single object that you see in this engraving, sold by Liberties, every single object was for sale through a secondary catalog. So remote from London, you were still able to do this. Full color reproductions of what the interiors could look like, and black and white photographs of how things looked when they went together, and pictures of enormous furniture designed by Liberty, sold through the catalogs, and could be taken to your home. He was setting the style. He was part of all of these movements. He saw ways of making money from them, but also promoting the quality of aesthetic experience. This is very important to him. And the chief aestheticians of the day, the people who told you how to lead your life, were, of course, the American painter Whistler and Oscar Wilde. So you could get full-scale pictures like this, and if you had enough money, you could go and buy it. And if you didn't have enough money, this sort of thing happened. So here we have a visitor who has gone to see the hostess, who is living in Upper Tooting in London, and she's saying, "We're very proud of this room. Our own little upholsterer did it, and everybody thinks it's Liberty." And the visitor says, "Oh, Liberty, Liberty, how many crimes are committed in thy name?" Well, that's the context until Knox goes to London in 1897, and he is no spring chicken. He's 33 years old. He's a fabric designer. He knows how to do furniture. He's learned architecture. And through the connection made by Bailey Scott, he finally gets to meet this extraordinary man, Sir Arthur Lazenby Liberty, who is overseeing an empire based on these styles and revivals of the Egyptian, all the things that I showed, but there was one thing missing. Note the bottom line. There was nothing British. And I think what happened culturally is people got tired of these revivals. What has Japan got to do with me in the end? What are these chinoiseries and turquoiseries? What do these actually have to do with me? Isn't there anything that, by God, is British? Isn't there anything Anglo-Saxon here? Well, there was and there wasn't. What happened was that Knox showed Liberty what he'd been drawing in the Isle of Man. So these are actual drawings by Liberty in which he's extrapolating and abstracting the forms that he'd seen on these Viking and early Christian crosses on the island. And when Liberty sees this, he realizes that that literary revival, the Celtic revival, that literary revival could actually have a visual equivalent. And so he commissions, on the spot in London, commissions Knox to make a series of pieces which he exhibits in 1899 to incredible success of Celtic revival silver and pewter, which he shows, and they're all bought instantly. And this leads Liberty to believe, well, things were not going so well at the store, wasn't making quite as much money as I did in the past, but this chap Knox could be my silver lining. Knox immediately leaves. I'm not sure how Knox did with people, but the first thing that he did was get back on the train, get back on the boat, and go back so that he could live in this gorgeous glen. He lived near that reservoir on the right-hand side, where he started to work. And he worked there for about 2 years, sealed off from the rest of the world, doing his drawings and making his preparations and sending the material back for Liberties to see and approve. He then moved to this little home, which he finished building in 1905 as a little arts and crafts home of his own. And I wondered why he had done this, because it seemed a little lavish for a person who was so hermetic and so modest and so reticent. And I worked it out when I actually went there. And I come to the realization, this is what happens with scholars sometimes. You suddenly find something that happens, you know about it. I know why he moved there. It's opposite the post office. And the post office was there before he built the house. He was sending sheafs of drawings down to Birmingham and then on to London, then back to Birmingham. So he built his own little Bailey Scott house, very small. He never married, no children, very tiny little house just for himself. While he started producing gold and silver works and pewter works for Liberty's and sending them back for manufacture. So the Liberty's metalwork venture was really in two parts. There's Cymric, which is a way of saying Old Wales, and Tudric, which is a way of saying Old Tudor. So this connection back to something that's uniquely British in the DNA of Britain, the Celtic and Tudor revival. So he goes back and he starts making work. So what does he make? He starts making things like this. These are absolutely extraordinary drinking bowls and chalices and flagons decorated directly with Celtic copying and then inserting into them tourmaline, jadeite, jasper, opals, setting those into these pieces so they have this Celtic overtone. And this one is particularly important because it's carrying all the stamps at the top. On the top left-hand side, it says Liberty & Co. Then it has the 3 stamps from the Birmingham Silver Assaying Office. And on the right-hand side, it says Cymric. So this is absolutely the most perfect kind of Archibald Knox piece. But he's also experimenting with other materials. He's inserting enameling into this. Fascinating thing about these pieces is that he never saw them. He never saw a single piece. He did the drawings. The drawings went to the post office across the street, went down to Douglas, got on the boat, sailed all the way to London. Liberty laid them all out on the tables. This, not this, that. And then they went back up to Hasler and Company in Birmingham, where the pieces were actually manufactured. Constant correspondence backwards and forwards between Knox on the Isle of Man, living in this remote location, and Hasler in Birmingham as to how he wanted the pieces to be made. And the range of pieces is absolutely extraordinary. So from flower vases like this to large plates, highly Celtic design with enameling in the middle, gorgeous cigarette box here. This is in Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then working with people that he never met. So he would make the base in silver of this piece, but the glass was made by Clutha in Glasgow, Scotland, and brought together in Birmingham, and then shipped to London for marketing. And the marketing was incredible. This was incredibly successful. They were selling hundreds and hundreds of pieces of work that had been designed by Knox. Some of them were commissioned, so you'll find them occasionally, like this wonderful Celtic flagon with a handle at the top, which you press with your finger and thumb, and the top opens up. And these fantastically successful and very popular christening sets for babies. You know, and the Victorians had lots of them, babies, I mean. Yeah. And everyone got a christening set. Or they got a knife, fork, and spoon, and a napkin holder in a box designed by Knox, and often made of shagreen, which is the material that comes from shark skin. Baby spoons, and what about taking three-dimensional objects? I mean, you look at most of the stones, and the design is flat on a surface. But what if you took that Celtic knotting and expressed it three-dimensionally? So here you have a Celtic toast rack. This was found in a car booth sale a few years ago by a student of ours at the Royal College in London who recognized it for what it was. It's an absolutely unique object. There is only one, and it's now in the V&A in London. But it shows the way that Knox was prepared to something that was flat, completely designed in a calligraphic way, and expands that out and makes it into something three-dimensional while retaining all of that Celtic history, or even making a picture frame for himself out of beaten copper. But what he also produces are fabulous objects like this. He was himself a high church Catholic, as well as being a Freemason. So he loved that sense of mystery and occasion. So he made a series of these goblets. They're very big, they're about so high, with lids that come off. And you could imagine them being used in a religious ceremony. Or perhaps you can imagine somebody from the Game of Thrones having their evening drink from this, probably, mead and water. mixing materials, starting to explore with inserting topaz and polished stones into the works, creating these kinds of chasubles. And in an amazing drawing, here's Knox himself looking over his own shoulder at a piece that he had designed. So these are like seaweed, growing up, and then containing something inside a polished stone, perhaps an agate, and then flowing up into the cup at the very top. These are extraordinary things. Here, that seaweed that we saw at the top of the runic drawings page, that seaweed begins to flow around the cup. And more sculptural. As he moves away from his original Celtic roots, he begins to produce things that is focusing on the outside of the piece, looking at the silhouette of the pieces, while still producing unique single objects. And this one's interesting because it says V&S. It has the date on it too. A commissioned single piece. And others, he was just dressing a cylinder. So here's a Clutha glass cylinder from Glasgow, in which he's then designed the pieces that are attached to it. He's doing this at long distance, no internet, no computer, and yet there was no loss in any of this. The specificity, the accuracy of the measurements, and the quality of the craftspersons who made these pieces in Birmingham was really quite extraordinary. And they marketed them like this, silver photograph frames or picture frames. And I draw your attention to the one in the top left-hand corner. Number 1, it says silver and enamel photographic frame, leather-mounted, cabinet size, £2, 2 shillings. Well, thank you, Mr. Neil Corbank. This piece has joined the collection of the Nelson-Atkins. And, Neil is here tonight. I can't thank you enough. It's emotional. It's a wonderful piece. This is an absolutely magnificent piece of Knox's work. It's got absolutely everything. It has all the hallmarking in it as well. We know the history of this piece. We've seen it advertised as it was in those books that were sent out by Liberty and Company. And so this piece, I think, is a really magnificent item to have come. So as a celebration tonight, have this piece come to the Nelson-Atkins Museum, and thank you again, Neil. Not just silver, working now in ceramics as well. So he would send drawings for making something that he wanted to have in beaten silver, but the manufacturer would say, well, you know, we could blow it up even bigger and do it in ceramics and paint it up and look like it's Chinese. Good idea. He'd send drawings like this for fabulously beautiful silver a serving set for salads or for fish with a wide-bladed knife with Celtic design on the left-hand side, and this absolutely gorgeous claw form that you see on the right. This is what he would send to London, and this is what Birmingham would make. So they're really quite extraordinary things. The drawings are amazingly elegant. They show exactly what he wanted. He'd had so much dialogue with the craftspersons in Birmingham, they knew exactly what to make. They were making these pieces that were both in glass and pewter, combining all of these together in a wonderful set of candlesticks. And I think I've sort of worked out where this might have come from, these very beautiful candlesticks. Remember the boat? Remember him working with his father and his brothers down there? Well, he was taking apart things like this. This is a ship's engine crankcase and a set of pistons. And I think he remembered those as he got a little bit older, because he turned them into candlesticks. And an extraordinary desk set in heavy silver. And this amazing object, designed around 1900 and finally manufactured around 1902. It's enormous, and it's thick silver. It weighs a ton. And it contains all of that seaweed that you see here in form of an enameling going around, along with these tourmalines and turquoise that is embedded in. Very architectural in its form. It's a rose bowl. It was commissioned only once by one very, very wealthy person or entity. It was commissioned by Lloyd's of London to be given as a farewell gift to the chairman of Lloyd's on the occasion of his retirement in 1904. This piece has a grill at the top. Equally, the Celtic design moving around so that you would put roses through it. Well, it's a rose bowl. And the problem with working in museums is that you often have to show candlesticks without candles, and you have to show rose bowls without roses. But when you do, it changes the way that you look at the object. The drama of the object is dramatically changed when the use of the object is addressed. So we were incredibly lucky to be able to have this piece in the studio and photograph it with roses in it. It's a knockout, isn't it? Absolutely gorgeous. So you see all of that entrelac design in the form of the seaweed, the rolling around the board, the strong architectural form supporting these roses is really quite an extraordinary thing. This object is in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, and they did a wonderful rehang recently in which they put it on a base, as you see here, next to the Manx piano made by the mentor of Knox, M.H. Bailey Scott, on the right-hand side. Kind of brought them back together. It's really quite an extraordinary thing. Collectible, highly collectible, of course. Valuable, very valuable. Not completely without reach. And there are major collections of Knox that have been built up in the last few years. All right, ready for a question? What American movie star has a magnificent collection of arts and crafts, has the very finest works of Liberty silver, which he loaned to me when I did an exhibition about Knox and Liberties in Japan, allowed me to have all of his silver collection, and loves Knox so much, the son is named Knox. Who is it? Ready? Brad Pitt. He was a sweetheart to deal with, too. The trouble with silver is it's expensive. So Liberties decided that they would find a way of taking the Celtic designs and start making them in a lesser material. But his standards are so high, that lesser material, lustrous pewter, was made in such a way that it could almost echo the quality of silver, but it would be about 1/3 of the price. So he starts working in these pieces. The difference being that much of the silver was basically hand-finished. It was cut by machine, but assembled by a single person and then put together. So very sculptural, dramatic forms. This is a crumb scoop. You know, your table needs one. Right? This is a polished pewter crumb scoop, and this also is going to come to the Nelson-Atkins Museum. A very dramatic piece. You put your hand here, run it across the table, and all the crumbs would jump into the tray. But not just pewter. Now he moves on to ceramics, and he starts working with another person who was completely anonymous and unknown, an extraordinary woman who was the wife of the painter George Watts, one of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And they start designing these enormous pieces made of very, very thick clay, earthenware, heavy in weight, but dramatic, often dramatically glazed, and they would produce catalogs in which they would set these out to you across the country. And they, of course, because of the railway system in the UK, they could ship you the finished objects. So it's amazing, but I calculated that between 1900 and 1908, he did 5,000 designs. So if you take 8 years, that's 2,920 days, 5,000 designs. He must have done 1.71 designs every day for that period of time. And look at what they were. Extraordinary. Rose bowls, tiaras, jewelry boxes, gravestones, which he did toward the end of his life, and one unique Celtic leather handbag. I don't know if there's another one anywhere in the world, but I did find it for an exhibition, and this is it. So it's about this big, with a strap. And then he moves on to gold and silver and starts producing absolutely gorgeous pieces like this, going back to those runics. Look at the patterning that you see on either side and at the top. Look at the way that this Celtic decoration has been drawn in Cummins's book and his own book. He looks at all of this and then reworks it entirely and starts making things like this. This is a gold, excuse me, a gold piece with inset diamonds and pearls and cabochons. You like to use semi-precious stones, a lot that could be polished. They are absolutely extraordinary in their elegance and their beauty, and they're endless in their variety. Because he was doing a design every day, he could send 1, 2, 3, 4 half a dozen. Look at this incredible piece. And think back to the neck decorations of those ancient Celts and Druids that we saw. Producing pieces like this pendant piece, gorgeous fire. The middle of each one of these units, the polished white, is not pearls, it's polished abalone. Absolutely wonderful and gorgeous pieces. These are the kinds of drawings that he was producing for belt buckles. Remember, there are 5,000 of these designed, and producing pieces like this. So the next time you see the Lord of the Rings, you'll know where that jewelry came from. This is all Knox-derived design, which was put into the film and worn here by Kate Blanchett and Liv Tyler. He goes back to the island on a regular basis. You know, he's always there in different parts of the island, drawing, going back to what he originally did, and starts to make a new series. And he takes these drawings here, and he thinks about what other form has that very powerful vertical with a very strong form at the very top. Well, clocks do. So he starts making a series of silver clocks in which the outline, the silhouette of the clock, is derived directly from those Celtic stones. And he joins that Celtic decoration around the edges of the stone, sometimes putting in almost naturalistic flower forms. And some of them look like tombstones. These are big. This clock's 19 inches high. We're talking about something that you put it on your mantelpiece, you probably have to have your mantelpiece reinforced. And this is silver. It's very, very expensive and difficult pieces to make. But they advertise different kinds of these, some of them mixed material. This one is in cut pewter with a copper face. This is abalone shell. This is abalone shell. The pieces that you see here are actually mother of pearl inserted in the clock, and they become much more architectural as they go forward, very dramatic in their forms. This is one of my absolute favorites, Knox's axe head clock with abalone inserts. It doesn't look like an axe head till you turn it sideways, and then it is. So, you know, some happy Viking would be pleased to have this. So let me show you this, how we see his design language change and how he moves from Celtic copying, where it's a facsimile reproduction of the Celtic designs that he's seen, to what he called adventurous modernism. So it's in 5 pictures, same subject, tea and coffee services. So, beaten silver tray, drama of the exterior volumes of the piece and the silhouettes of the piece, use of new material like rattan, sometimes ivory, those handles, with the decoration derived directly from Celtic designs as repoussé seen on the surface. Then he begins to strip that back. So in the second picture, you see that there's much less of that decoration, and he's more concerned about the volume and the silhouette. In this one, there's just a very small amount of decoration. It's really the silhouette and the volume that he's interested in. And this extraordinary set, with this wonderful hot water jug on the left-hand side, looks like a penguin, with cabochons inserted in, until eventually he strips away all the decoration, and it ends up like this. This is a single-service coffee pot in silver with ivory, and again with turquoise inserted. Around 1908, he starts doing a lot more work in wallpaper. So he's crossing from materials to materials, from scale to scale, and starts doing these pieces which are based on Celtic designs, but he starts mirroring them and folding them. Very dramatic and very beautiful, and still in production. Liberties of London actually, about 10 years ago, started to bring these back to life. And then carpets on a very large scale, including working for the Wilton Company, producing carpets like this. This is in the V&A in London. And this extraordinary Celtic carpet, which he designed, again, for Morton and Company. Then he starts working on calligraphy, because basically his relationship with liberties begins to fade away. As we approach World War I in 1914, things change. People are not able, they're scared perhaps, not able to buy those very expensive big silver pieces anymore. So he turns inward, and for 20 years, he starts working on these incredible illuminated manuscripts, going back to those old days of looking at the Book of Kells. And they're absolutely amazing things, and they're big. They're the same as the Book of Kells. They are deluxe gospel books. There are probably 150 of these. They've been declared a national treasure, and they're being held by the Manx Heritage Organization that represents Knox's estate. You see, this time he doesn't have a client, so he's able to let his imagination fly free. They are quite amazing objects. Deriving, as you can see here, specifically from a Celtic cross top, and here too. While he's doing something as extraordinary as that in this calligraphy, he's also gone back out into the landscape. He's gone back to doing what he did as a child, starting to draw the landscape, working in watercolor. He was a master watercolorist. Look at this. He knew how to handle this material in an extraordinary way. And he became famous on the Isle of Man for doing these landscapes, none of which he ever sold to anyone. He gave them only to his family, produced hundreds of these pieces. He would be out there all day long in the pouring rain, the sleet, and the sun, drawing, making work that was small and tightly focused, or big, big landscapes with big dramatic skies. He became so famous that you could buy a postcard on the Isle of Man that had a railway engine with Knox painting in the bottom left-hand side. All of his relationship with liberty was gone by the beginning of World War I. The market had changed. The entrepreneur, the shopman, the great liberty knew what was coming next, which was going to be the war. He knew things were going to change. So the business relationship severed, the friendship did not. And so Knox, in 1914, found another job. He became the censor at the Knockanlow prisoner of war camp on the Isle of Man. This was a very big camp, one of three. He was the censor of that, so he watched all of the material that came into the camp and all of the material that went out. So this was a German prisoner of war camp. And here are German prisoners in a barbed wire compound where most of the Germans in this country ought to be. The important thing about this is that as he was doing this, he saw every single piece of paper that came into the camp and every single piece of paper that went out. And so it must have been a surprise when the work of a parallel genius, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, sent a set of drawings for furniture to be made. Now, in order to keep the prisoners occupied so that they wouldn't riot, they worked out in the camp that a lot of these men, Germans, knew how to make furniture. So they brought them together and they created this incredible furniture workshop. So here they are bashing away. The interesting thing is, look at the piece of furniture on the right-hand side. This was designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, was being made by these Germans to be shipped back. It's quite extraordinary that these two men who never met but must have known about each other. Now, Mackintosh couldn't have known who Knox was because Knox was anonymous. But Knox knew exactly who Mackintosh was because he was reading all those copies of the Studio magazine. So this piece of furniture, this suite of furniture is made in the Knockanlow camp. You have this wonderful moment when these two great giants are together for just a few moments. And this is the finished work in one of the prisoner of war huts, characteristic Mackintosh furniture, black with mother-of-pearl insets. And this is what it looked like when it had been shipped to England and installed. Knox comes to the end of his life in 1933. He, of course, in advance of his death, designs his own gravestone. So he goes back and he looks again at these Celtic crosses and makes his own cross. And he's buried here, and what this reads, is a little difficult to read it as it is. What it says is this. Right? And I think he was a humble servant of God. And I think he did work in the ministry of the beautiful. So I called this talk, Liberty's Silver Lining, the forgotten genius of Archibald Knox. But why was he forgotten? And the answer is this. Liberties didn't want anyone to know who their designers were. So we finally found a sample contract from the late 19th century, and this is what Liberty wrote. It is the policy of Liberties to suppress the names of individual designers and manufacturers in favor of a single uniform associated with the Liberty brand name. Thus, Liberties maintains strict secrecy in the attribution of objects to their designers. they deliberately never told anybody who they were employing, including Knox. Well, they may have had a strict secrecy rule, but I don't. So I'm delighted that I've been able to tell you about Archibald Knox. Thank you.